July 1941. The country seemed to be ablaze under the onslaught of the advancing Wehrmacht. Every day brought new reports of fallen cities, retreating armies, of chaos and despair. Into this maelstrom, when millions of people rose to defend their homeland and heroism at the front became commonplace, the USSR secret services sought their own, sometimes cruel and invisible paths of resistance. Beyond the public, often propagandistic aura of the feats of Soviet intelligence officers and saboteurs, there was also a shadowy side, one not openly discussed. This was the history of false flag operations, grand disinformation campaigns, and sometimes liquidations of both our own and enemy personnel, all for the sake of achieving strategic goals. In those days, when the country's future hung by a thread, victory at any cost became the sole measure of morality. In this ruthless game, as attributed to Lavrenti Beria, the main principle was simple. He who forces the enemy to believe in his false reflections wins. It was on this principle that the most daring and little-known NKVD operations behind Wehrmacht lines were built, where agents operated under a foreign mask, becoming phantoms in foreign uniforms and with foreign names. In these first weeks of the war, when nights in the occupied territories were particularly dark and the smoke from fires obscured the sky, the first chapters of this story unfolded. Somewhere behind German lines in July 1941, another village burned. From the ruins emerged several people in German uniforms. They were hailed in German, but among themselves they spoke Russian. These were NKVD agents left under a false name. Their mission was just beginning.
The chaos of the Red Army's retreat in the summer of 1941 became for the NKVD not only a tragedy, but also an opportunity to deploy a new, unprecedented secret war. Already in July 1941, as the front rolled eastward with alarming speed, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs began forming dozens of secret sabotage groups intended to operate in German-occupied territories. These were not just partisan groups. These were detachments created with an eye toward long-term and deeply covert work. Their ranks included career Chekists, vetted party activists, and sometimes even ordinary peasants recruited to form so-called sleeper cells. These individuals were to become invisible fighters, blending into the population, awaiting their hour. A little-known but extremely important aspect of this strategy was that some agents were left in villages with false documents, testifying that their owners had died during evacuation or gone missing. Their task was to awaken and begin operating only when the Germans had firmly established themselves in the captured territories and the occupation authorities had weakened. This required incredible endurance, complete self-sacrifice, and a willingness to live in constant fear of exposure. At the time, there were rumors, later somewhat confirmed, that some cells had their execution specially staged to ensure reliable cover. This was intended to definitively convince local residents and the occupation authorities of their loyalty or complete annihilation. This tactic was extremely risky, but in the conditions of the first weeks of the war, when other means of resistance were catastrophically scarce, the NKVD resorted to any measures. A quote from the diary of an unknown NKVD officer found in one of the archives eloquently describes the mood of those days. "We remain. Let the enemy think we have disappeared. Our time will come." These words became a kind of credo for thousands of invisible fighters left behind enemy lines, ready to wait, to camouflage themselves, and to strike surreptitiously, under a false guise, deep in the enemy's rear. July 1941 marked not only the beginning of a great defensive war, but also the starting point for one of the darkest, most complex pages in the history of Soviet intelligence.
After the first sabotage groups were formed and left deep behind enemy lines, the NKVD faced a task no less complex than the formation of these cells themselves. How were agents to blend into a foreign environment? How were they to integrate into occupation life so thoroughly as to become invisible to the enemy and unsuspicious to the local population? The main tool became meticulous disguise and the creation of an absolutely plausible legend. The NKVD actively trained its saboteurs not only in basic sabotage and reconnaissance skills, but also in the details of daily life, language, and sometimes even the dialects of the regions where they were sent. Agents were taught not just to speak German, but to think like Germans, to understand their culture, habits, and even gestures. Some posed as representatives of ethnic minorities living in the USSR, for example Volga Germans or Poles, whose presence in the occupied territories would not raise unnecessary questions. This gave them an additional degree of protection, allowing them to merge with the mass of displaced persons or local residents who, in one way or another, interacted with the occupation authorities. The process of integration was long and agonizing. Agents had to completely renounce their former identity, their native language, their habits and mannerisms. Every step, every word, every glance could betray them. They were taught not only external resemblance, but also internal transformation, so as not to give themselves away even in their subconscious. There were controversial but persistent rumors about loyalty checks conducted by the NKVD even in the early stages of the war. For instance, according to the memoirs of British historian Max Hastings, in August 1941, the NKVD allegedly dropped groups of agents in German uniforms into the Volga region. The purpose of this operation was not so much sabotage as testing the loyalty of the local population, especially ethnic Germans. This story, although it remains a subject of discussion and lacks absolute archival confirmation, formed the basis of the legend of the NKVD's most brutal checks, demonstrating the extreme degree of distrust and paranoia prevalent at the time and the willingness to go to any lengths to identify potential traitors or strengthen discipline. A fictional sketch from those days vividly illustrates the essence of this life under a false name. Imagine Helmut Krauss, who's been living in a small Belarusian village for 3 months. He neatly trims his beard, wears a German dog tag, politely bows to the occupation soldiers, and in the evenings peacefully converses with neighbors about rural affairs. None of them even suspect that beneath this carefully constructed facade, under the neatly trimmed beard and shiny German dog tag, hides Alexei Rubtsov, an experienced NKVD agent whose Russian eyes merely awaited orders from Moscow. He lived in constant tension, his nerves stretched to their limit, but he was ready for his mission, completely dissolving into a foreign life, becoming an integral part of it. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of such Helmut Krausses and Waldemar Schmidts, and each of them carried a deadly secret, awaiting the moment when it would be time to tear off the mask and strike. Their existence was a constant performance, where any mistake could cost not only their own lives, but also the lives of those connected to them. And this game continued for years.
One of the least known yet most insidious directions of NKVD activity behind Wehrmacht lines was the principle of creating so-called sleeper agents and cells. This was not merely intelligence gathering, but a long-term, strategically planned system designed to operate months or even years after their infiltration, when the enemy already felt completely secure. Evidence indicates that starting in 1942, both the NKVD and the Main Intelligence Directorate, GRU, actively operated an entire network of secret sleeper cells. These agents could remain silent for months, sometimes even years, fully integrating into occupation life. They posed as neutral artisans, doctors, millers, teachers, anyone whose profession or social status would not arouse suspicion and allowed them to exist unhindered behind enemy lines. Their primary task was not immediate sabotage, but rather gathering information, building agent networks, and waiting a special order, which might come at any moment, or not at all. The life of a sleeper agent was a constant psychological ordeal, requiring incredible endurance and self-control. A little-known fact, discovered in archival documents, points to the existence of a program called Repeater. This was a complex and ingenious communication system developed to maintain contact with deeply embedded agents. Information exchange occurred through seemingly innocuous letters and radio signals emanating from private individuals who remained behind enemy lines. These letters could contain coded messages, encrypted in everyday phrases about health, weather, or family matters. Radio signals could be transmitted at specific frequencies at specific times, disguised as ordinary broadcasts or amateur radio sessions. This allowed contact with agents to be maintained without risking exposure of their network through premature activity. However, like any large-scale and risky operation, the sleeper cell principle had its dark side,
and tragic consequences. Interpretation of archival data shows that for many sleeper agents, their mission ended ingloriously. Despite all precautions, the Germans sometimes uncovered these networks, leading to arrests, torture, and executions. But even more tragic was the fate of those who survived. After the war, when the Red Army liberated territories, Soviet counterintelligence viewed with great suspicion those who had been behind enemy lines for so long without openly participating in partisan struggle or underground resistance. Many surviving NKVD agents were later eliminated as unverified, accused of collaboration or double-dealing. Trust was undermined, and their sacrifice often proved futile. A quote from an NKVD report from 1943, found in the archives, very accurately reflects this ambiguity and danger. Some agents became so deeply involved in their role that they forgot whose side they were on. This testified to the fact that psychological pressure, the need for complete assimilation, and constant life under a false name could lead to a blurring of identity, a loss of connection with the motherland, and ultimately a complete loss of self. The fate of these people, who sacrificed everything for their mission, often remained unknown, and their feat unrecognized.
NKVD agents left behind enemy lines did not simply act as scouts or saboteurs. They were true masters of illusion, expertly playing on the fears and weaknesses of the enemy. False flag operations became one of the key tools in their arsenal, allowing them to sow panic, disinform, and disorganize the Wehrmacht while remaining in the shadows. The NKVD actively used captured German uniforms, genuine and fake German documents, to simulate the actions of their enemies as plausibly as possible. Agents didn't just wear foreign uniforms, they became them. They staged the appearance of fictitious detachments of loyal-to-the-Führer deserters, or lost Wehrmacht units, supposedly operating in the occupied territory. The goal was multi-layered. On the one hand, to create a false picture of the presence of German units where they were not, confusing the Wehrmacht's own command. On the other hand, to use these fictitious detachments to spread disinformation among the local population and even among German soldiers themselves. There are many examples of such operations. One of the most effective methods was fictitious radio communications. NKVD agents, using captured German radio stations and knowledge of German codes and communication procedures, simulated negotiations between imaginary German units, transmitting false information about troop movements, operational plans, or even invented losses. These fake radiograms, intercepted by German counterintelligence, were perceived as genuine and caused confusion and errors in planning. Similarly, dispatches were forged and then accidentally fell into Wehrmacht hands, or information was leaked through German radio networks, further confusing the enemy. The goal was to make the Germans believe in their own, but distorted reflections. A little-known but extremely cynical fact, demonstrating the depth and ruthlessness of NKVD methods, relates to the infiltration of agents into German prisoners of war camps for Soviet prisoners. These agents, often former prisoners of war themselves, recruited or specially trained, infiltrated the camps under the guise of ordinary prisoners. Their tasks were diverse, from gathering information about morale and attitudes among prisoners of war to identifying traitors collaborating with the Germans and potential saboteurs who could be recruited for use against the enemy. These agents lived in inhumane conditions, risking exposure every second, and their fate after completing the mission often remained tragic. A vivid illustration of such an operation can be the image of Schultz. During the day, he walked around the barracks cursing the Russians for the defeat near Smolensk and demonstrating complete disillusionment with Soviet power. None of his cellmates, not even the guards, suspected that at night, this Schultz, covered by a blanket, illuminating himself with a flashlight, transmitted radiograms to Moscow using a homemade coil. He was a phantom, existing at the very heart of enemy control, sowing disinformation, gathering valuable data, and completely dissolving into his legend. These shadows without a homeland paid a huge price for their invisibility,
and their sacrifices often remained unrecognized and their names unknown. Among all the NKVD operations conducted under a false guise, one of the most famous, large-scale, and simultaneously dirty games of the Soviet Special Services was Operation Scherhorn, also known as Berezino. This grandiose disinformation campaign, which unfolded in 1944, became a masterpiece of deceiving German intelligence and entered the textbooks of special services as an example of how to make the enemy feed and facilitate their own demise. Facts show that in 1944, when the Red Army was already confidently advancing, Soviet state security agencies developed a daring plan. They created a fictitious group of remnants of the German army, supposedly cut off behind the advancing Soviet troops somewhere in the forests of Belarus near Minsk. At the head of this group was placed a captured German Oberst or Colonel Heinrich Scherhorn, who agreed to cooperate with the NKVD after thorough processing. The essence of the operation was to make the German command believe in the existence of this forgotten group and begin supplying it, thereby revealing their communication channels, agents, and resources. Operation Berezino truly became a masterpiece of disinformation. NKVD agents, posing as Scherhorn's group members, maintained radio contact with the German command, transmitting carefully prepared, plausible reports about their dire situation, about fighting Soviet partisans, and about the need for assistance. The Germans, despite all suspicions, believed the legend. They were convinced that they were maintaining contact with the heroic remnants of their army, who continued to fight in the Soviet rear. The interpretation of events is striking in its audacity and effectiveness. The Germans, seeking to support their heroes, regularly supplied Scherhorn's group with everything necessary until the end of the war: food, medicine, ammunition, equipment, radios, and even new agents who were dropped behind enemy lines for communication and to reinforce the unit. All of this, of course, went not to German soldiers, but directly into the hands of the NKVD. Moreover, the Soviet Special Services used the radio transmissions of Scherhorn's group to transmit disinformation to the German command, misleading them about the Red Army's plans, the number of Soviet troops, and the directions of strikes. This allowed the Soviet command to gain tactical advantages and maintain the initiative. As the famous Soviet intelligence officer Pavel Sudoplatov, one of the organizers of the operation, noted in his memoirs, the meaning of this grandiose game can be expressed in one phrase: "We made the enemy feed our ears." In other words, the NKVD not only received valuable resources and information, but also used German intelligence itself as its own communication and delivery channel, completely controlling the game. A fictional sketch from those days vividly conveys the surreal nature of the situation. Somewhere near Minsk, deep in the forests, a bonfire burns. Around it sit German soldiers in neat German uniforms. In reality, these are NKVD agents in disguise. At this moment, a parachute descends from the sky, carrying another container of aid from Berlin. One of the Germans, Russian Lieutenant Klimov, picks up a captured can of stew from the ground, thoughtfully sent by the German command, and smirks. "Thanks again, Goering." This scene, repeated many times, symbolizes the triumph of Soviet counterintelligence and the humiliation of German intelligence, entangled in its own illusion. Operation Scherhorn was not just a successful sabotage, but a deep psychological victory, showing how far the NKVD was willing to go to achieve its goals, playing with the enemy like a puppet.
Any war ends, but for those who operated in its shadows under a false guise, returning to normal life often proved impossible. The price paid by both living and dead NKVD agents who carried out sabotage behind Wehrmacht lines was incredibly high, and their sacrifice often remained not only unrecognized, but also punished.
Post-war facts paint a grim picture. After the end of the Great Patriotic War, dozens and possibly hundreds of NKVD agents who had heroically operated behind enemy lines were repressed. The paradox was that those who, at the cost of incredible risk and self-sacrifice, performed the most complex tasks often found themselves on lists of the unreliable. They were accused as deserters, or those who did not return in time. The absence of their names in official lists of underground fighters or partisans, as well as the very fact of their long stay in occupied territory, made them suspicious in the eyes of the post-war Soviet authorities, obsessed with the idea of finding traitors and purging the ranks. The Chekists, who had previously sent them to their deaths, now became their accusers. A little-known fact that only intensifies the tragedy of their fate is that some sleeper agents returned home years after the war ended. They had gone through the hell of conspiracy, survived the occupation, perhaps performed feats that no one would ever know about. But upon returning, they found that their families had already been exiled as families of enemies of the people, or were considered dead. Their homes were occupied, their names forgotten, and their appearance caused suspicion rather than joy. The state for which they had sacrificed everything rejected them, considering them tainted or potentially dangerous witnesses to its shadowy side. Rumors and scattered archival data also indicate that some NKVD agents operating in Europe chose not to return to their homeland. Realizing the risks of repression, fearing inevitable suspicion, and the impossibility of proving their loyalty, they decided to remain in liberated Europe. They concealed their past, started new lives under new names, forever cutting themselves off from their former homeland and family. This was their way to survive, but at the cost of complete oblivion of their true identity and history. A fictional sketch from those years penetrates the very essence of this tragedy. 1946. In a small town in eastern Germany, a letter lies at the post office addressed to the distant Soviet Union. It contains only a few lines. "Mother, I am alive, but do not return. Here I am still under a false name." These words, written by a person who once was a Soviet agent and now became a citizen of another country, forever losing the right to his true identity, symbolize the fate of thousands of such shadows without a homeland. Their feat and their suffering became part of the vile secrets of the NKVD, hidden behind the veil of official heroism and forgotten for the sake of preserving the purity of state ideology. They were heroes without glory, victors without triumph, whose lives and deaths were given for a victory that brought them neither recognition nor peace.
Victory always leaves shadows behind, those that do not appear in parades or textbooks. In the NKVD archives, there are no triumphant marches, only reports, dry summaries, and short phrases behind which other people's lives are hidden. An agent returning from the German rear rarely became a hero. More often, an object of suspicion. Those who wore foreign uniforms, spoke a foreign language, and lived among enemies themselves became foreign when they returned home. In 1945, when the fronts rolled back to Berlin, for many sleepers it was time to awaken, but not to be liberated. Some were sent for interrogation, others to camps. Still others simply disappeared. Their names, their exploits dissolved between the lines. Reports often stated, "Contact not re-established, agent's whereabouts unknown." This phrasing replaced a verdict. Historians debate whether the NKVD's actions can be considered heroism or ruthless pragmatism. After all, behind the foreign masks lay not only intelligence but also cold calculation. Operations like Berezino, where the enemy fed and supplied their own executioners, went down in history as a triumph of disinformation. But behind this triumph were people
who later disappeared, those who had learned to lie too well. Often, an agent who successfully completed a mission could no longer live otherwise. His past dissolved in a foreign name, in a German passport, in the habit of looking at the world with suspicion. They lived between two worlds, Soviet and occupied, and both worlds ultimately rejected them. In the archives, there are rare letters, short, fragmentary. "Mom, I'm alive, but don't come back. Here I am still under a false name." These lines, written with a trembling hand, seem to encapsulate the entire paradox of their fate. Victors who remained in the shadow of their victory. Today, as archives open, it becomes clear the line between heroism and darkness was thinner than one would like to believe. Behind every act of sabotage, behind every successful deception of the enemy, there was a price. Human, psychological, sometimes meaningless. The NKVD acted in the name of the state, but its methods left a mark not only in history, but also in the souls of those who were under a false mask. And when we look at their faces in old photographs, in German uniforms but with Russian eyes, we understand the mask was never removed.